My pard's greatest love was to ride. That's where things made sense to him and where he felt so alive. He'd saddle up his horse and go out in search of whatever God had put out there. I'd always ask him what we were doing, and he'd say, "What needs to be done?" I remember that first outing with him. We long trotted as far as 12-year-olds could, and down by a stream, we found a deer that had been caught in the fence. We tied the horses to a nearby tree. I tried to sneak up on it so that I could help it, but he just walked on past me, whistling the tune. I just knew the big buck would tear him to shreds, but it just looked at him as he gently cut the wires that had dallied its legs together when it didn't quite jump high enough to clear the fence. If that wasn't amazing enough, when the buck was free, it turned around and looked hard at him. Then it seemed to bow its head slightly, and then with a snort, it was bounding off into the brush. He just laughed and then stuck out his hand for a fist bump. The adventures we had were always like that. Every year during the holidays, we would ride out in search of what needs to be done. As we got older, the adventures got bigger and better. I took up the trade my father had of being a blacksmith. My muscles were big from working the bellows and later the hammers. I learned to shoe horses and form the iron shoes that we would nail to their feet. I didn't get to do much riding because of my responsibilities in the shop, but I always looked forward to the holiday when my pard would come back. I would always watch for him as people from all over the country passed by the shop. No matter how hard I watched for him, he always showed up when I wasn't looking. I would turn my back for just a second, and then when I'd turn back around, he'd be standing there with a grin. Before I could say anything, he'd look at me and then say those same words he said to me on that very first day and all the other days that I ever saw him. "Let's go." He never waited for an answer or to see if I'd come. He knew I would, and so did I. We were both 29 years old that day, and we rode out with no particular place in mind. It was a beautiful day, and everyone seemed to be out enjoying the weather. We were on the outskirts of the city, riding down a well-marked trail when around the bend came some cowboys. I immediately got to the side of the road out of respect, but my pard just kept riding. I hollered at him to get out of the way, but he just kept riding right down the middle of the trail. They were all dressed up in the finest clothes of the land. They had pressed shirts with big wild rags that had been hand-ironed with a hot stone so that the edges were crisp and fine. Their big hats were of the finest quality, and it seemed not even the dust of the trail would dare intrude upon this perfection. The leggings they wore were handmade from the finest craftsmen. They fit perfectly and had long tassels with sterling silver hand-engraved conchos. Their boots were polished like a mirror, and the toes were pointed, and each cowboy sported the most beautiful set of spurs you'd ever seen. The silver work alone would cost more than I would make in my lifetime. The rowels were 5-pointed and big and mean. One look at the horses and you could tell that the cowboys knew how to use these beautiful tools. And that wasn't in a good way. But I shouldn't say things like that. A fella could get in mighty big trouble for saying anything about a cowboy that could even be construed as negative. The horses they rode were solid white. That was a sign of the cowboys' perfection, and no one was allowed to ride a white horse except them. They were magnificent. Their nostrils flared as they carried the cowboys to and fro. Each step was a thing of beauty. They were trained to show power and purpose in every move. But to me, it seemed that every stomp and turn was more out of frustration and futility rather than purpose. They looked a lot more like war horses than work horses to me, but I know nothing of being a cowboy. Their bridles were of the highest quality leather available. They sported spade bits that must have weighed the same as a bucket of feed. The hackamore were fine braided rawhide connected to the rider with perfectly woven hair that came from some animal far, far away. Well, the way the cowboys acted, it must have been unicorn hair. The saddles had more silver on them than an old lady's head. Now, I certainly mean no disrespect with that statement. I could not have said an old man's head because the saddles were beautiful, not rough out. The horns were big and showy, wearing a silver cap that reflected sunlight onto the cowboys' faces as they rode. The saddle strings nearly drug the ground, they were so long, and the rawhide riata ropes hanging beside their legs were 200 feet long. Each cowboy's foot rested in a tapadero. These eagle-tail leather-covered stirrups nearly reached all the way to the ground. You see, the cowboys ran everything. Sometimes it was in the open, but most other times it was behind the scenes. They trained their whole lives to sit those silver-adorned saddles and horses. It was an accomplishment, to say the least. These were the top hands in the land, and they had memorized every rule and regulation about being a cowboy. Their horses would do anything and go anywhere. They never missed a step or a cue. The cowboys could rope better than anyone else. Their loops never missed, and their riatas never broke. Every Sunday, they put on demonstrations of how to be a cowboy at the sacrificial arena. These events packed in the people, and everyone oohed and awed at the skill, and then went back and practiced all the do's and don'ts so that they too could ride into the forever pastures when they died. You see, the cowboys were the keepers of the code. The cowboy's code basically told you everything a cowboy had to do to get into heaven. That might not seem so bad, but it was consecutive after one. In other words, if you ever missed a single loop or a single dally, you were out. You could enter back into the competition for heaven only by offering a sacrifice. If you weren't in the competition when you died, the fire got you. Every day inside the sacrificial arena's huge building, people would bring in their best cattle to offer up as a sacrifice. It had to be the best you had or it wasn't accepted. Not obeying the code was serious business, and it took a serious sacrifice to get you entered up. They would turn out one of the bulls into the arena, and a cowboy would come out with 3 swords. He would ride up to the animal and stick a sword into its back. The animal would try to fight, but it was to no avail. After 3 of these swords were sticking into it, a spear would be brought in, and the cowboy would make a big show of killing the dying and bleeding animal by sticking it through the side and right into the heart. Then and only then were that person's sins forgiven and allowed to enter back into the competition. This was the reason the cowboys had so much power. They decided if your sacrifice was good enough or not. If you crossed them, they wouldn't accept it and you could never enter back in. But it wasn't just that. Some people didn't have a good enough animal to offer, but the cowboys had that covered. You could buy an unblemished one from them. This was a big business. Since it was so hard to keep the code, these sacrifices took place all day long. Then the cowboys feasted on the beef that was killed, while most other people merely had bread to eat, if they were lucky. I'm sorry, I have digressed. Back to the game of chicken going on in the middle of the road. I hollered for my pard to move out of the way again. He had a stony look upon his face, and he and the cowboys came to a halt in the wide trail. White horses stamped the ground, sending ripples through the dry dust on the trail. For what seemed like an eternity, the cowboys and my young pard stood there staring at each other. One of them finally commanded him to move out of the way or suffer the consequences. My breathing was fast and shallow, as I dared not say anything for fear that my help would only endanger him more, but it might get me into trouble as well. "Who are you, boy?" the leader of the group asked. There was a long silence, and then my pard asked his own question. "What have y'all been doing?" Another one sneered to reply, "Everyone knows that we've been out gathering sacrifices from the desert so that people who do not have their own cattle can enter back into the competition. You must not be from around here, or you would have known that." A hard-faced cowboy on the left rode his horse up beside my pard and looked down on him in his mount with unhidden disdain. "I know this runt. He's from one of the camps up north. His father's a simple handyman, and not a very good one at that." They all laughed. The leader spoke up again. "What's a handyman's son doing sitting a horse?" He got no answer. Finally, the leader of the group rode his big horse forward, knocking my pard's smaller mount out of the way. The others followed suit, and my pard was bounced around like a toy boat caught in the rocks of a stream. When they were past him, they thundered off again. I rode quickly to his side, expecting to see anger or shame. But what I saw surprised me. When I looked into his eyes, I saw only sadness. I put my hand on his arm and asked him if he was okay. He didn't say anything, but he did put a calloused hand back on mine and gave a little squeeze of thanks. We sat there on the wide trail facing opposite directions. I didn't know what to do. It was a straight shot to the sacrifice arena from here. This was the main trail that everyone used to enter the city, and that was the first thing you saw. I could see the Cowboys riding through the wide gate in the arena now, but still we sat there. After the gates closed, I turned back towards my pard. My heart rate was finally getting back to normal, and once again, I tried to speak to him. "What were you doing? You could have gotten in a lot of trouble." A hawk cried out from above, and we both looked up. We watched it for a second and then turned to me with a fierceness I'd never seen before. It only lasted a moment, and then he said with a smile, "What was I doing? What needs to be done. Let's go." He leaned forward and his horse jumped into action. They shot off the trail and into the brush. I tried to turn my horse left and it tried to turn right, and we ended up dancing around in the trail like a couple of greenhorns before we got on the same page and rode off after him. He urged his horse faster and they took off. With each pounding of the lead hoof, the horse stretched out his neck in cadence with the run. My horse followed the best he could. We thundered through the brush, ducking and diving as well as jumping. Several times I wanted to pull up and quit. I had nearly fallen off half a dozen times, and I had a cut on my cheek from a branch that I saw way too up close and personal. But every time I made up my mind to stop, my pard would turn around and smile at me as if to say, "Let go of your fear. Keep going." His smile was contagious and it affected me greatly. I gave my horse all the reins I had and he found another gear. Instead of worrying about falling off, I threw myself into the ride. I yelled and laughed as I tried to watch how my pard rode. He became one with his horse and I caught myself doing the same. All of a sudden, my pard and his horse disappeared. My heart leapt into my throat. I tried to pull up, but my horse yielded not, but seemed to speed up. At the last minute, sure that I was about to fall off the same cliff that had swallowed my friend, my horse jumped. I screamed as we flew over the precipice. I wasn't sure whether to watch my death come or shut my eyes and just let it happen. My mind opted for something in between the two, and I saw through squinted eyes that we had not jumped off of a cliff, but rather onto a steep downhill grade. My pard was still at a run, and I didn't see how his horse was able to keep its feet. My horse landed and continued at the same speed. I still had not stopped screaming, and that might have been a good thing. It blocked out my desire to pull up on the reins and stop. Looking back, it probably would have killed me and my horse if I had. The ride down that steep hill took forever, yet it was over in a second. I was still clutching the saddle horn with all my might when my horse slowed and walked up beside my pard, who had stopped next to a clearing. There was little water in this desert part of the world. What water was around usually had people living next to it. Here in the middle of this clearing was a nice water hole surrounded by a barbed wire fence. Outside the fence were wild cattle that were dying of thirst. You could see their pain, and some of the younger ones were cut up from trying to crawl through the tightly stretched 9-wire fence. Movement caught my eye, and I watched a group of cowboys ride into the clearing. Behind them came some greenhorns that wanted to be cowboys driving a caged wagon to transport the sacrifices they would rope. But that's not what happened. To make a long story short, they put some water in the caged wagon and only allowed a few nice-looking unbranded bulls to go up the ramp and drink. A greenhorn shut the gate and the wagon turned off in the direction of the arena and disappeared. We watched from concealment and my heart was sickened with what happened next. One of the cowboys walked over and opened the gate. Cattle rushed the gate, but only cows that had unbranded calves were allowed in to drink. When they had drank their fill, they were beaten back out. The gate was locked, and the rest were left to die. I was disgusted. These cowboys preached about being real cowboys, but they sure didn't do it here. They just laughed and joked as they rode out of the clearing and back towards the arena. We sat there for a long time watching the frantic cattle run back and forth, trying to find a way in. A tear rolled down my face, and I closed my eyes as I wiped it away. When I looked up again, my pard was riding towards the fence. The cattle bawled at him, and he spoke soothingly to them. There was no way he was going to be able to get that gate open. The lock and chain were too big, and the corner posts were large and set deep. But he had no intention of fiddling with gate or post. He took his wire cutters out, and I gasped as he cut the top wire. It twanged in the stillness of the meadow, but the sound that was even louder was that of an ironic note. He had cut the wire right next to the sign that said, "Property of the Cowboys. Keep out under penalty of death." One by one, he cut the tautly stretched barbed wire and then stepped out of the way. As the cattle rushed in to drink, I heard him whisper to them, "But those who drink the water I give will never be thirsty again." It becomes a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. I sat there dumbfounded, unsure what to make of what I had witnessed, much less heard. He got back on his horse and rode over to me. There was a seriousness in his face, and when he got to me, he said, "I have need of your blacksmithing skills, my pard. When I come back next year, I want you to have a branding iron made for me." I made brands for people all the time, so the request wasn't out of the ordinary. I asked him what it was to be. A rockin' J? A hammer and nail? What? He told me that he wanted it to be a modified X brand. The lower right leg of the X was to be extended by a third. I wouldn't recognize the significance of the brand until 4 years from that day. That was the day that I watched him die. But little did I know at the time, I would beat him to the grave. I got to work right away. That was one of the longest years of my life. I could sense a growing change coming to this large land that we called home. People were discontent with a lot of things. A big corporation had come in and took over the land. They really didn't care what we did as long as we paid the rent to live on their property. They had hired thugs and mercenaries that collected the rent every month. There was no written and agreed to amount. Whatever the rent collector said you owed, that's what you owed. You better pay it. The corporation allowed us to continue the ways of the cowboy that we had practiced for so many generations. They knew that it kept the people in line, and I'm sure that the cowboys were treated rather nicely for their help in keeping the peace. It was a year later, and the holiday was fast approaching. I watched constantly for my pard, just as I had done for the past 18 years. My dad had passed away, and the blacksmithing shop was now my own. I worked day and night making different things for a variety of people. One of my main sources of income was the arena and the cowboys. I shod all their horses, and they paid well. That's not to say that I got any special treatment or thanks. Everyone was expected to give the cowboys their best, and it was supposedly a privilege to work for them. But it only brought me dread thoughts when they walked in their arrogant attire and false portrayal of who they were supposed to be. I heard something outside, and I quickly moved to see if it was my friend. My heart sank and my mood faltered when I saw the front end of a white horse. "Not today," I said resignedly to myself. I took a deep breath and went back to work quickly. I would always make them wait for a few hammer strikes. It was the only power I had before I had to submit to their whims and wishes. A figure filled the door, and I ignored it. The cowboy stood there for a second, but something seemed strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I couldn't see the sparkle and shine I normally did when a cowboy walked into the shop. I didn't hear the jingle bobs dancing off of fine silver spurs that usually trumpeted the arrival of a cowboy. I finally looked up and saw a smiling face. "Let's go," my pard said. I stood there dumbfounded. The handyman's son had become a cowboy. This baffled me because he was nothing like them. He turned around and walked out, grabbing the brand that I had made for him off the hook where it had hung by the door for nearly a year after I had finished it. My hammer dropped to the floor. I grimaced as it hit right on my big toe, but that didn't matter to me as I tore the smithing apron off and followed my pard outside. I squinted against the brightness of the sun, and I saw him step into the stirrup of a white horse. But there was something different about him and his attire. He didn't wear the fancy clothes of a cowboy. He had on blue jeans and a pearl snap shirt. Far from the fancy outfits his new brethren were so fond of. His horse was also calm, not snorting and pawing the ground in anticipation of the next movement or fork thrashing. Hanging beside his right leg was a well-used riata, not one of decoration. His boots were dusty and the spurs were there, but they were kind in comparison to the daggers that the cowboys wore. His saddle was a plain and well-worn wade, and there was no silver to polish. You could see the marks left by seat and legs where they had worn into the leather. It was obvious that this saddle had been used every day. I looked at him, and I know my mouth had been hanging open. When I tried to speak, my tongue had dried out like a 100-year-old cow pie in the desert sun. He smiled at me and then said something to someone who was mounted on another horse behind him. It was the first time that I noticed the 12 men riding with him. They didn't sit upon white horses, but rather good, stout ranch horses. One of them, a fellow named James, brought up my horse that was saddled and ready to ride. He handed me the reins without a word, and I stood there, dumbstruck by the sights before me. My pard gave a nearly invisible cue to lead off. I still had not closed my mouth, and the dirt from the street nestled among my teeth and caressed my already dry tongue. My horse looked at me as if to say, "Shall I go on with or without you?" I towed the stirrup and loped off in pursuit of the 13 men. As we rode, I could see a transformation in my pard. He was a man that people were drawn to. When we came upon people along the trail, they always smiled or waved. This continued until we were far past the houses and settlements surrounding the arena and the big houses of the corporation. When we hit the open spaces my pard and I had rode for so long, he struck a long trot. We had gone many miles when one of the guys with him rode up next to him, and I heard him ask, "What are we doing out here?" I smiled, and I knew the answer. What needs to be done? We came upon some cattle way out in the desert that were grazing on some nearly invisible shoots of grass, and my pard ordered several of his compadres to dismount and start a fire. He handed them the brand I had made and told them to heat it up. To those who were still mounted, he said that they were going to start their own herd and that it would start right here. One guy, a fellow named Tom, spoke up and said, "We can't just go in and brand anything that we find. That's against what the Cowboy Code says. The unmarked cattle belong to God and God alone." My pard smiled and spoke with kindness. Does a son have to ask permission to use his father's brand on his own cattle? All the animals of the desert are mine, and I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. They all understood what he was saying, and they knew if the cowboys heard him say that, they'd kill him. When the fire was built and the iron was hot, my friend rode up and threw a beautiful turnover loop that the calf he was aiming at never saw coming. When his riata landed true, he dallied around the mule-hide wrapped horn and drug the bawling calf towards the fire. One of the men was quick to move into position for the heel shot. I would see this man many times and know him as Pete. He often missed, but he was always the first to throw a loop. My pard spoke encouragingly to his compadres, and finally, one of them was able to snag 2 feet and lay the critter down. I was proud to say that I witnessed the first long X brand to be placed upon the hide of an animal. But I knew that the same brand was placed that day upon my heart, for I knew that I would follow this man and ride for his brand, no matter where he went. We branded all the unmarked calves and even cows that we came across that day. When we were done, we always led them to water and made sure that they were taken care of. We doctored many with hoof rot and other ailments, and when we rode back towards home, he paused and gave permission to all those that we came across that were hungry to go out and find the calf with the long X brand and butcher it for their family. One of his compadres spoke up and asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. Is it legal according to the Cowboy Code for a person to eat another man's beef? My pard never balked in his answer. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry again. And so it started. From even those early days, many came to follow him and learn from him and call him their Savior. I wasn't able to go with him very much. Like I said, I was a blacksmith, not a cowboy, but that didn't mean that I never got to see my pard. He would often come over to my house, weary from the trail and without all of his compadres. He used my place to relax, and he always brought a sense of peace and comfort with him when he came. Well, except for that one time. There was one time when he came over to the house. My two sisters adored him, and while one tried to show him respect by cooking and working, the other chose to merely sit and listen to him, enjoying his company. My busybody sister got angry and asked my pard to send her sister in to help her with the supper. But he merely told her that her sister had chosen the better course of action, and he wouldn't tell her to get up and go help. He knew that she needed his company. I grinned and knew that I was instantly in trouble from the look I got. Time passed by like it always does, and I saw my friend every once in a while. One day, while I was working in the shop, putting shoes on one of the silver-studded Cowboy's horses, and it pulled away from me, slicing my thigh all the way through my shoeing leggings. Since my benefactor was standing right there blaming me for my incompetence, I didn't say anything and finished the job as quick as I could. When I received my payment, I wondered again how someone so hateful and egotistical could be a God's chosen teachers. That line of thinking was short-lived as I went in to bandage my wound. It was deeper than I thought, and I grimaced as I put stitches in my thigh. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but it was definitely one of the worst injuries I'd had. I limped home that evening, and my sisters took turns cleaning my wound and chastising me for my lack of concern. I should have heeded their warning. The next day, I woke with a fever. My sisters said I should stay home, but I had work to do. I knew that my family relied upon me for the income and care, and I wasn't about to let a little scratch keep me from caring for my family. I went to work, and by the time I got home, I knew I was in trouble. I barely made it in the front door and collapsed. I don't even remember that happening. I just remember I woke up from a bad dream, sweating and hurting from the throbbing in my leg. A doctor was there and applying a poultice that he thought might do the trick. He left, and I could see the worried look on my sisters' faces. I gave them a reassuring smile and a thumbs up. And then I passed out and had the most horrible dream ever. I found myself in my blacksmith shop. I was hammering away at a project when all of a sudden I saw the wall behind the forge catch fire. I tried in vain to put it out. When the fire spread across the roof, I decided to vacate the premises. Little to my comfort, though, when I got outside, the flames had engulfed the entire town. I ran for my life, ignoring the pain in my leg. I got to the wide trail and noticed the flames had not engulfed the arena. There was nothing to burn in there. I started to head toward its safety when I heard a familiar voice call out to me from the right. "Let's go." I knew the voice but couldn't see the person. I frantically looked for my pard but couldn't find him. I once again started to turn towards the arena, but off to the right I heard his voice again. "Let's go." How could I follow someone that I couldn't see? But inside I knew what he was saying. It wasn't just a physical following, but a spiritual one. Every time I had followed him physically, he had led me out into the country. I turned right and ran away from the sacrificial arena. The fire raced along behind me, licking at my heels, and on I ran. I ran right down the hill that we had barreled down so long ago. But unlike the first time, I tripped and fell, rolling down most of the way. I passed by the small clearing with the water hole. I noticed the fence had been repaired, but that didn't matter to me near as much as the wildfire that had made its way down the hill. Gaining momentum as it went, I passed by the first branding spot, noticing the charcoal remains of the fire that had heated the brand I had made. Still, I ran on. My muscles and my lungs, begging for a break and relief, moaned with a constant complaint of pain and fatigue, but still I ran on. It's not like I had a choice of direction. The fire guided me as I ran toward where it was not. I was nearly out of breath and stamina, this time for good, when I spotted a cave high upon the hill that I was forced to run up. The fire was blistering my back when I finally reached the mouth of the cave. I pushed a rock the same size as the small opening of the cave to protect me from the smoke and heat. How I was able to do that, I will never know. I guess adrenaline and impending death will make you be able to do things you wouldn't normally do. Once safely inside, I breathed the first fresh breath of air and heard the roaring fire right outside. I sat down on the dirt floor of the cave, light from the fire seeping in through the cracks of the makeshift door. I leaned against a small rock shelf and cried for my pards and family that must have surely perished in the fire. When my heart-wrenching sobs had bled themselves dry of tears, I became aware of the first time of something on the rock shelf behind me. I slowly turned around and stood up in the narrow cave. I looked at what lay on the shelf behind me and saw that it was a body. It was wrapped in death rags, and my heart rate doubled as I realized I was in a tomb. I reached up, unable to control my actions, and pulled the cloth away from the face. As the face came into view, I fell back. I beheld the face of my best pard, the man that I had known and ridden with for most of my life. Sobs once again encompassed me like quicksand, with no relief or rescue available. But it was then that I heard a voice calling from outside. It was him. How this voice could come from outside when he clearly laid here was beyond me. All at once, the stone in front of the tomb was rolled away, and I heard my pard's voice again, this time calling my name in a familiar fashion. Lazarus, let's go. When I walked out of the cave, everything was the way it had always been, only I was wrapped with cloth and in a different location than I remembered. I heard my sisters gasp and cry out. Then I heard my pard say, unwrap him and let him go free. As some people did so, I never took my eyes off of him. He had tear stains marking a path down his face. Obviously, he had been crying. I finally walked over to him and fell down to my knees, realizing for the first time that it was I who had been dead. The fire had been so close to getting me, and I knew that somehow my pard, no, my Savior, had indeed saved me. As I looked at him with questions on my tongue, he leaned down and cupped my face in his hands and said, "You've been given a glimpse of the salvation available to all who believe in me. I must go to the grave also, but I will come back, because the first fruit of the harvest to come. Tell no one of what you have seen until all I have spoken of has come to pass." And I obeyed. But now you need to hear the rest. For all have come, and we celebrate this time with infinite joy and with ultimate sadness when we realize for what was given to us that day that I'm about to tell you about. My pard went on to brand every stray he could find with the long X. He made many enemies, especially the cowboys. They had tried to trap him, catch him, insult him, and even accuse him of being the devil himself, but nothing ever deterred him or got in his way. When the holiday came around again, this being the third year since we rode out with the Long X brand, it all came to pass. One of his own compadres had turned him in for a bounty of 30 pieces of silver. They arrested my pard that night, and he didn't fight back. Pete tried to chop someone's head off, but in typical Pete fashion, he missed and merely got an ear. My pard healed that man before he allowed himself to be led away to a mock trial. Man, that was so him. Taking care of others, doing what needs to be done. I didn't know about any of this until the next morning when my sister came running in and yelling that they were going to kill our pard. She was in near hysterics, and I was quickly joining her as she recounted what she heard. Seems that my pard had finally told the cowboys the truth. He was the Son of God, and he would be the final sacrifice. They had torn their clothes in maniacal anger and sent him to be sentenced to death by the local head official of the corporation. No one could be killed on their place without their permission. That man, Pilate was his name, wouldn't sign the death warrant because none of their laws had been broken. But the cowboys said that my pard had violated their most sacred code, and that if they let this go unpunished, there would probably be rioting in the streets. Pilate sure didn't want a riot on his hands, so he decided to let the people decide who would be killed, my pard or an outlaw. My sister said that everyone screamed for the outlaw to be released and for my pard to be crucified. She said the cowboys all patted themselves on the back as he was led out of the city by the corporation's mercenaries, carrying the plank he would be nailed to. I ran as fast as I could towards the killing fields the corporation liked to use. It was a long run, but nothing could stop me. I pushed through people and even knocked some down, but I didn't care. I cried and prayed that this wasn't happening to my best pard. When I got there, I didn't recognize him. They had already used the 3 swords on him, but they weren't sticking out of his back. These swords were 3 long nails sticking through each hand and one large one going through both of his feet into the wood behind. How a man could lose so much blood and die was beyond me. Through my tears, I looked around for his compadres, and I only found one. John was one of the best guys that rode for the Long X, and he was standing at the foot of the cross with some women. I knew one to be my pard's mother, and the rest I had seen from time to time. When noon came, my buddy had been on that cross for about 3 hours. If he looked bad before, he looked even worse now. He had to push up on his nailed feet to draw a single breath, but the agony was so intense that he would drop back down. Then the only thing holding him up there were the bones of his hands and the nails that pierced them into the wood behind. Over and over, this struggle to breathe and pick the pain played out its macabre death dance. All of a sudden, darkness covered the land. It was like someone had drawn a blanket over the sun, and all the land fell silent. It was getting close now. You could feel it. I cried, but no tears came. My heart felt like it was breaking in two. I wanted to get up close to talk to him one more time, to tell him that I loved him, to tell him that I believed he was the Son of God, to tell him so many things, but they wouldn't let me get any closer. So I stood up and I yelled as loud as I could, "You cannot leave me! There must be another way. Why are you doing this?" His head raised up. I knew he heard me, but through his swollen eyes, I knew that he could not see me. He seemed to sense me, and although I didn't hear the words, I saw them on his lips. I do what needs to be done. I don't know how long I sat there and watched. It felt like forever. I prayed that each breath would be the last and his suffering would end, but it did not. Not for the longest time. I was watching him when he lifted his head towards the sky, and this time, it was he that cried. Tears were shed from his eyes for the first time, and I felt my heart stop when he yelled out, "Dad!" This time, everyone was crying. I could hear his mother's gut-wrenching sobs. Once again, he yelled out, "Dad! Why have you forgotten me?" My pard hung there and sobbed for a minute, his tears cutting through the blood on his face as the nails tore through his flesh and the breaths came shorter and shorter. He said something to a guard nearby, and the man lifted a sponge up for him to drink from. And then my pard looked at us all, and in one final breath, he quietly said, "It is done." And then my pard died. I watched them as they finished the sacrifice of my pard exactly as they had done to all those magnificent bulls so many thousands of times. They came in and thrust a spear through his side and into his heart. It was at that moment that the ground shook and a loud cacophony came from town. I turned and saw that the sacrificial arena had been torn in two. One of the mercenaries standing there hit his knees and said, "Surely this was the Son of God." I knew that this day would come. I had seen it already, but that didn't make it any easier. I spent the next day, what the Cowboys called the day of rest, simply staring out into the countryside and remembering all of our times together. The day crept by, and my throat hurt from crying so much. The next day was Sunday, the first day of the week, and I went to work like I always did. But today, instead of getting right to work, I sat there in silence as the sun started to gray the eastern horizon. I stared at the door where he had appeared so many times before, and I wondered if I would ever see him again. The sun peeked over the edge, seemingly oblivious to the pain that I felt in my heart. My pard had told me that he would come back, but I was doubtful. I couldn't help it. I shook my head and prayed a quick prayer, and then picked up my hammer and got busy. I stoked the forge fire. I was in no mood for this. All of a sudden, a shadow filled the door. "Go away," I said. "I'm busy." The shadow never moved. Finally, irritated, I turned around. The man's face was hidden because of the sun coming up behind him, but there was no mistaking the voice that said, "Let's go."